Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq, with daily insight on the Nasdaq-100 index, or the NDX, which is made up of 100 of the largest domestic and international non-financial innovative companies listed right here on the Nasdaq stock market. The NDX has been the barometer for U.S. large cap growth and also one of the best performing indexes over the last decade and a half, not to mention one of the most liquid index ecosystems in the world. And joining me today, we have Ben Jones, who's a product development specialist with the index research team at Nasdaq. We're going to take a look at some trends, relative strength in the market as the Nasdaq-100 appears to be back to positive. Ben, it's great to have you with us for the first time. And, what are your high-level thoughts around some of the market action that we've seen this week to kick off?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And, we take a step back and look at the market. It's been quite resilient the last few weeks, right? Where we've essentially seen a lot of these growth companies reverse a lot of the losses that they experienced throughout the whole, correction of, COVID-19 starting at, let's say, end of February, right? I mean, you look at the Nasdaq right now, basically positive territory. It's basically kind of where it was when it started the year, looking at the Nasdaq-100. And it's being driven by a lot of these areas that, touched everyone's lives, right? Technology, healthcare. I mean, those are the two sectors that have really been, quite robust and powerful for leading a lot of these market indexes to positive territory. And what we see looking at a lot of the indicators and looking at the data, I think what we see at these kind of market inflection points is just volatility. I think that's kind of what has been the norm when we see moves like this. You look at a lot of the indicators that, we're tracking on the research team, as well as some of the indicators that are available on the Nasdaq research platform. Typically when those indicators are at these levels, we typically see just higher volatility. So that's kind of what we expect, at least for the near term. But overall, Jill, I mean, the market is resilient really across the board, especially in those areas that are more growth oriented in technology, consumer discretionary, and of course, some of the healthcare sectors, like biotechnology.
All right, Ben, let's pull up our first chart here, taking a look at a point and figure chart for relative strength on the Nasdaq-100.
Yeah, so if you look at this particular chart, what we see is that tracking the Nasdaq-100, which again represents essentially the 100 largest non-financial companies listed on the Nasdaq stock market, right? It is predominantly heavily allocated towards information technology, communication services, consumer discretionary. It has some healthcare, and if you just look at this index over time, you can see that on an absolute basis, it has performed well. It did experience and took part, so to speak, in the market correction. But right now, what we see with this particular index is that it's moved back to a positive trend. This is looking at the chart, the point and figure chart, which is available in the Dorsey Wright system. It tracks the absolute price of this index over time. And what you can see is that it's been making a series of higher highs, which essentially means that we're seeing rising prices. And so if we look at this particular chart, which is a longer term chart for this index, we see that it moved back to a positive trend there about in mid-April, April 16th, really to be exact, looking at, let's say, a 50-point chart and even on the 100-point chart. So the key here is that, while the index wasn't immune from the correction, it has been able to rally back, right? And it has been able to get back to, basically the early 2020 levels. And you really haven't seen that from some of the other indexes that track whether the growth style box or track core U.S. equities. And that's when you start to get into the relative strength side of the story, Joe, where the Nasdaq-100 is even, more stronger than a lot of these other indexes that kind of track U.S. markets.
Yeah, and we can see that on the next chart here, where you have the Nasdaq-100 versus the S&P 500 index.
Right. So if we go back to the last 5 years, so, think, kind of 2015, during that time period, the market experienced some volatility as well. It was, ironically driven by a lot of volatility in energy prices. But the 2015, 2016 markets were quite volatile. And, it was a market that really favored large cap names. And it was a period in time where, basically we saw the Nasdaq-100 and the S&P 500 kind of flip-flop back and forth, kind of who's going to be that poll leader, so to speak, to kind of, carry the market forward. But something happened in mid-2016. We started to see the Nasdaq-100 really take charge and start to outperform. And that's what you see in this chart. This essentially tracks the, relative strength, so to speak, the relative performance, tracking the total return price of the Nasdaq-100 versus the S&P 500 index. And as this chart moves higher, it's basically showing you that, the Nasdaq-100 is outperforming the S&P 500. And what's interesting about this is that, if you look back in time, 5 years, the Nasdaq 100, just on a pure, price return standpoint, has rallied about 93% compared to, let's say, the S&P 500, which is about up 32% over that time period. So, it's really translated into strength for this particular index. And, a key word I said earlier is just resiliency. You can see on that, the far right-hand side of this chart is that, we did see kind of a brief period where the Nasdaq 100 did, underperform when it fell, but notice how it just bounced right back, right? And so that's what you want to see, especially if you're tracking momentum in the market, where, there will be periods of underperformance, but the key is that, is there resiliency? Does it have the capability to bounce back? And that's exactly what we've seen with the Nasdaq 100. And that really goes back in time. And so you can see just the strength exemplified in this chart.
All right, then, and to wrap up here, let's take a look at sector exposure. What's driving the return in the index and the breadth?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and that's really the heart of the story, right? If you look at the Nasdaq 100, it is heavily overweight information technology, right? And that's been one of the key drivers. Where if you look at the Nasdaq 100 technology exposure relative to the S&P, it's almost double that. Right. And so when we think about the Nasdaq 100, it is kind of tech and discretionary. And that's been, one of the strong areas of the market, right? Whether you are thinking about it fundamentally, how, our daily lives have changed and we're relying on technology more, or just that's potentially where the growth is going to be going forward. But from an index standpoint, one of the interesting things that the Nasdaq Dorsey Wright Group tracks is kind of breadth and participation in different equity universes. And so anyone who has access to Nasdaq Dorsey Wright can check it out. And they have a great tool, or an indicator rather, that tracks the percent of stocks that are on buy signals within a universe, or tracks the percent of stocks that are in a positive trend in a universe. And right now, the Nasdaq 100, about 71% of those stocks are on a buy signal. Right. And about 66% of those stocks are in positive trends. So, we're seeing some very healthy performance across those 100 stocks. So it's not just a few that are carrying it forward. And that contrasts to about, only 63% of the S&P that's on a buy signal, or 42%. And so what we see, breadth and participation, and a lot of that is coming really across the board. But more importantly, it's coming from the key overweight areas, which is technology, and also areas where the Nasdaq 100 doesn't have exposure to, right? We think about it. There's no financials in the index. Mm-hmm. And one of the areas that has been in the press lately is energy, right? Just the volatility in crude oil. There's no energy exposure in the Nasdaq 100 as well today. And that's, one of the key areas. It's sometimes not what you maybe allocated to, it's what you're not allocated to. And that's another part of the story here.
That's an excellent point, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thank you so much.
All right, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.